Hi, it's Dr. Steve from Misericordia University, and welcome to class week number 2 of Principles of Interface Design. We will have 3 videos for this week's class sessions. The first one, we're going to take a look at curb appeal and metaphor as we consider different design issues for screens and interfaces. This week's class will be divided into 3 different videos, 3 different parts. So let's look at overall design issues of curb appeal and metaphor. In the second video, let's take a look at how you can achieve balance in screen design. And in part 3, our third video, let's specifically focus on designing web pages. In his 9 significant events model of teaching, Robert Gagne talks about the importance of gaining attention of the learner. So let's begin there. Let's start with the design concept of curb appeal. If a buyer, so to speak, is going to purchase something, which could also mean our learners buying into an educational technology product that we're, so to speak, selling to them, the first important step is for them to gain a positive first impression. In real estate, that's known affectionately as curb appeal. How does it look when you park the car and look at it from a distance, even before you walk up to the property or even set foot in that house? What does it look like? Because this is important because your first impression may affect your motivation and about your decision, in the case of real estate, whether or not to go in at all. Gagne talks about that curb appeal, although he doesn't refer to it as that, as an important part of stimulating the learner's interest. He talks about gaining their initial attention. So we're talking about motivation. So if you don't catch the learner's attention at this time, it can set a tone already. It can set a negative tone for the learner using the application. And if it's an option in your classroom and it's not a requirement, students may not opt to do it. And if it is a requirement, maybe they won't approach it in a positive way that would really help them get through that and to really use it to its full potential. So curb appeal, the initial impression of the learner in this case, is a really critical component of an interface design. Now, Gagne also asserts that a teacher has to gain attention and regain attention throughout a lesson or throughout an ed tech application. But again, to reemphasize, that initial impression is really critical because you would not want your learner to use that application on half power, so to speak. If it's designed to provide additional information to somebody who's interested, the learner may not go there. So again, if it's not a requirement, maybe they'll choose not to, just based on the way it looks. Think about yourself. How many things, when you're making a purchasing decision, have a lot, that initial impression has a lot to do with your purchase and your motivation to get started into using that item, whatever it is. Same thing in education. In the Misericordia graduate course, Instructional Design, we talk about the importance when you're designing an app to really understand your learners. So let's just raise that issue here. We're talking about curb appeal. What is going to appeal to your intended learners? What do you know about your audience? Because what is going to interest maybe first graders will not at all interest sixth graders. And if you're looking at people who are 16, 17 years old, they're going to be on a whole different plane in terms of interest, knowledge, sophistication, and motivation. So just to remind that if you have taken the instructional design course, this is where the audience or learner analysis really plays an important part. If you haven't taken that course yet, well, then we'll introduce some of those thoughts now, and you'll study that more in depth at a later time. So at this point, Let me just introduce a couple of things to think about, and as a debriefing from this week's session, we're going to revisit these thoughts and have a chance to discuss them online via a discussion board. What might indicate to your to your intended audience that this app is going to be of interest to them, or it's going to have some value for them, it's worthwhile for them to get into? So besides the content and the deeper look, let's look at the overall audience itself. What interests them? What excites them? What kinds of things appeal to them? Because that could help us when we're designing the metaphor, when we're designing the screens and looking at the overall application. And then let's think about the curb appeal aspect, that initial look and that initial motivation, that initial draw. What would draw your learners into an application? What would appeal to them either visually, in many cases visually, or using some audio, certain graphics, certain colors? What would draw them into the application? Some other thoughts to think about. As a designer of technology products for education, what specific things might draw attention or provide that curb appeal to inspire curiosity, to get learners initially interested in different media? What if it's a web page? What kinds of devices or strategies or techniques could you use in order to make that web page more appealing? PowerPoint, about a PowerCast when you're using audio and visual. But when you're doing a video, a screencast. About if it's just audio or just exclusively print? What could appeal to your learners? When you are designing an app, it might be helpful to create an overall design theme known as a metaphor. Let's take a look at metaphor. One goal that all designers have in mind when they're creating is to make an interface that's going to be user-friendly, something that requires a very low learning curve, something that's easy to figure out, and ideally something that's intuitive and they really don't have to learn it. They can just kind of feel their way through it because it makes sense to them. One way of doing that is to create an organizing overall metaphor. A metaphor, by definition, is an organizational theme that helps the learner understand the application and navigate through the application by using some theme, some storyline, some metaphor that is easily understood both in the whole and in the parts. Ideally, the metaphor should be familiar and comfortable and understandable to your intended audience, to your intended group of students. And even moreover, if it could somehow be related to the material that's being presented, then that makes it even more clear to the learners. A sound metaphor should be robust. It can consist of different parts and subdivisions and various pieces that will make it suited for complex topics and just the overall environment, different elements that you might include within that environment. On the low end, the metaphor should be selected or designed in such a way that the learners can just intuitively figure out what the various parts of the metaphor mean in terms of navigating through and using that application. On the higher end, just as when you're teaching face-to-face with students, on the higher end, a metaphor would be able to help students understand the content that is being learned in the process. So at least in terms of interface, at least at the low end, we definitely, as designers, aim for that. At the high end, we could aim at a more lofty goal, in which case the metaphor can be used to aid the learners to actually understand the content better. So let's take a look at an example. One metaphor idea to organize an application could be transportation. Now, this could work with younger students because you can use students who are riding a bike and are riding on roads, and they'll be aware of road signs and things of that sort. If you're dealing with 16, 17-year-olds, they're more familiar with driving a car, and their interest and motivation is in that direction. So this could be a robust metaphor in that it could actually be used with different ages and different groups of learners. So considering that, if you selected this as your organizing metaphor idea, let's say you wanted to have 3 different paths through the same content. You could use the bicycle and say this is the slow, comfortable ride through the material. Learners who say, well, I kind of know it already, maybe I just need to, I need to go at a little faster pace on that. You could use a little sports car as part of the metaphor. You could use an airplane for someone who really is very familiar with the content and they're just kind of reviewing and highlighting certain parts of it and they're getting ready to be tested on it. Then you could use symbols for going back through the material and also stopping the application. Stop sign would certainly fit this metaphor as well. To carry the theme further throughout the application, if you're going to use a progress gauge that's going to let the learner know how many screens have they gone through of the material, what percentage have they completed, you could use a tachometer or a speedometer. For navigational symbols going through the app, you could use road sign type symbols. When they take embedded assessment or a final test as part of the app, you could put the score like on a speed limit sign as an example, or a highway sign that has a certain number attached to it. And also, this opens up, this metaphor, different possibilities of sounds to use as feedback, like horns, screeching tires, different engine sounds, the initial startup sound of the vehicle. So notice how we can open up all these different possibilities and give a feel or a theme going throughout that entire app. Think about these questions in regard to your creating various products to use with your students. What possible metaphors could be generated considering both the interest of your learners and also the subject matter, the content of your intended application? So again, remember the high level and the low level. When we look at different metaphors, what would they understand? What would they recognize? What would give them that curb appeal? What would draw them in? What would motivate them? As you're thinking about that, think of these 3 different areas. What are some graphical components that you could use that would fit into that theme? What are some sounds that are associated with that theme that you could incorporate into that app? And also, what parts of that metaphor, which of these items could be used for navigation to make it understandable and make it more intuitive and easier for learners to navigate their way through that app? Let's look at some examples. A good metaphor should be intuitive, we keep saying. And by that we mean it's something that allows the user to easily navigate and figure out how to navigate that application without a steep learning curve. Here are 2 screenshots from more commonly used metaphors, ones that you might already be familiar with. When we look at the bookshelf metaphor, it's really easy to determine what to do here. You can click on any of those books. We understand what a bookshelf is. We understand that to read a book, you have to take the book down, so we can click on it. So again, that becomes a very easy way to navigate a complex database of various materials. On the right, in this picture, you can see a desktop. So a desktop has been used for many years in a variety of ways because there are different tools on here, and we understand what those tools are. Everyone's familiar with some type of desk and various tools that are used on a desk or in that type of environment. And notice in this environment we even have drawers and there are drawers with little icons on them. So those can take on special meanings. We all know what a drawer is, but with an icon added to those drawers, now it adds another level of understanding of that. So again, when you look at any type of interface like this, any kind of metaphor like this that's used within an interface, it becomes much more easily understood. You can organize a whole bunch of things and help with navigation, and also help the learner understand what all is available in that tool without putting or resorting to a bulleted list of text or a text-based menu. This becomes easy to get into and to get around. A good metaphor should interest the users and appeal to them. And again, at the high level, ideally, should also be related to the content of what they're going to see and deal with or learn about. Here we can see two such examples. On the left, this is from a website called the Exploratorium. And one of the aspects of this website, one part is they talk about structures that are buildings and structures, bridges and so on, from around the world. So notice the organizing theme here. It's a girder for a building, the structure of a building, a skeleton of a building. Notice the little extra elements that they've added here. So it kind of gives the feel of it. It has that initial curb appeal, draws the learner in. Notice the steam shovel crane that's up on top. They've added the piece that says structures, which is the title. They have various flags there, so you could see something about either locations in the world or languages. Notice that there are embedded on the right-hand side, it's a little small here in this depiction of it, the screenshot, but on the right-hand side you'll see there are different elements there that are just navigational elements that are built right into this structure. And then in the middle of this, in the white space that's available, they also have other navigational pieces, such as different things about building and various elements you can build structures with, and one whole section just on bridges. Then underneath that, they have a photo gallery and things about the website itself. So it organizes, but it draws the learner in, and then once you go through this interface, should you come back into it a second time, you can quickly navigate through it a second time. In the second example on the right side, brew by feel. Craft beers are really big at this time, and they have been for a little while. Here, this is the part of the interface from a website from an Australian brewing company. Now look how it already has that look and feel of something that you might do in a brewery. You could see the dials and the gauges and so on. There's some switches there. When you take a look at it, the initial interest, the curb appeal, is going to be here. But also take a look at the various elements that are there. Click on one and look about products, look about home brewing, learn about the brewery itself, and so on. So you get a better feel for things here, and you kind of get into the feeling of the content in this metaphor. Now, they could easily have scrapped all of this and said, I'll just put on a website, maybe I'll just put a text-based menu, maybe a series of bullets. But how much more interesting and appealing is this metaphor to draw you into and help you navigate around their site? That's the power of metaphor. In summary, for our second week's class, our first video, we looked at some overall design issues when you're looking at designing interfaces, and that is curb appeal and metaphor. In our second video for this week, we're going to take a look at achieving balance when you're designing individual screens, and in our third video for this week, we will examine designing web pages.